welcome to this episode of Disrupt Ed TV. Today we are joined by the fabulous Dr. Nina Hood, who is the founder of the Education Hub and who has spent the last 7 years at the helm, and this year is stepping away from that particular role. And our aim today is to talk a bit about the role of research in education, how we can access it, how we can make the best use of it, and some of the risks that go with the way that we use it. So, Nina, how are you? Welcome.
Thanks, Claire. Great to be here. I'm doing well.
Now, for those of our listeners who might not be so familiar with your work and your background, can you just give us a little quick summary of your journey through education? Obviously, I know it well because I used to get to hang out with you at one stage of that journey, but just a little bit of background about you and how you came to set up the Education Hub.
Sure. So I started my career as a secondary school teacher with you, Claire, and then did a master's and PhD in education. And following that, briefly took up a full-time role at the University of Auckland in the Faculty of Ed. Very quickly realised that full-time academia, not the right fit for me. And I'd always been interested in the nexus between research and practice, and very much coming through from my own experiences as a teacher and then also being an academic and thinking about how we could bring those two worlds closer together. So that's essentially the genesis for the Education Hub, which is the organisation I founded. And the Hub has a mission to bridge the gap between research and practice in education, to see how can we make research, and research broadly defined, more accessible and practical for the everyday needs of teachers.
And do you feel like that has happened? Do you feel like the Education Hub has come a certain way in terms of closing that gap?
Yes and no. Yes, we've made some progress. I don't think we've closed the gap. I don't know if we can ever close the gap. And I'm always the person that's going to see all the issues and the problems and where we haven't done enough and all the work that still needs to go into it. Look, I think we've come some way in terms of making research, or some research, more accessible, encouraging teachers to be engaging with that and giving them new avenues for doing that.
Yeah. So in terms of a teacher, like I noticed earlier today on DisruptED on Facebook, there was I think she's a middle leader or a school leader that was looking at conducting a curriculum review at their school and was asking around some recommended readings and some ideas. What's your advice to teachers and leaders when they do want to be proactive around reviewing and they want to start engaging with research? Where do they start?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a tricky one, right? Because, your sort of academic style research, your academic papers, journal articles, and so on, most of them are inaccessible because they're behind paywalls. And also, I would argue that, individual articles, they tell you something, but actually they tend to be pretty narrow. So their applicability in a school context or a classroom context can be somewhat limited. And then, if you do a Google search, you come up with thousands of different possibilities of things that you could read. And then you're trying to make judgment calls on, is this a reliable study? To what degree, can this be applicable to my context? So it can be challenging. But I think, if we look particularly over the last decade or so, a growing number of organisations, both in New Zealand and around the world, are existing to make research more available.
Yeah.
And are doing a really great job of that, and are coming at it from different perspectives as well. So there are a reasonable number of avenues. I mean, the curriculum one's fascinating because there's actually really very little good empirical research on the impact that curriculum has. So we've got lots of theoretical studies about what a curriculum should include or shouldn't include, but very little that's actually got empirical evidence to say, if you design a curriculum like this, it's likely to lead to these sorts of outcomes.
Yeah, and because I find that a lot of, I sort of suggested readings, and I thought very quickly, I was sharing readings around initiatives and priorities rather than curriculum design in and of itself. And that stuff has its place and it's really worthy material. And, I absolutely do back reading Teaching to the Northeast and Niho Taniwha and other pieces of research. But I realised beyond your paper that you wrote last year around some of the limitations around curriculum design, there wasn't a lot coming to mind around research around the art of curriculum design.
It honestly, the more I've dug into the educational research, the more I think, there are so many things that we just don't know about, or we don't know enough about it. And the mind actually boggles, and you think, we've got this growing number of educational researchers around New Zealand and around the world, and yet they don't always seem to be asking the questions that really need to be asked. And curriculum design is a great example of that.
I can't help feeling that the time is a bit ripe for another round of the best evidence synthesis. Like, I sort of think about those two guiding documents, and for those who joined the education sector recently, they may not even be aware of the best evidence synthesis. And personally, that's still something that sits at the back of my mind as a fantastic starting point, because it literally is just bringing together all the best evidence and synthesizing it. And I wonder if it's actually time for something like that to happen again.
Yeah, I think it could be incredibly valuable. I think also sort of if you took that as a starting point, actually then using that to identify, well, where are areas that we need more research? And then providing targeted funding and research projects that deal with actually building that evidence base that we need. So you've got more of a sort of set of national priorities around, where are the gaps in our knowledge and how can we go about addressing some of those?
I feel like the best evidence synthesis went a part of the way, and nothing will always go all of the way, to address some of the risks of polarization and binary thinking around the right way and the wrong way. Like, you and I have both been engaged, and tried to be part of that conversation, that it's not skills or competence, it's not skills or knowledge. It's not this or that. It's not structured or balanced, literally. Like, it's, and there's a real risk of us engaging with research that just reinforces our biases. I can't even get my words out. And we get stuck in our way of thinking, and it's really easy to find research that just doesn't really challenge my way of thinking about what I think good teaching and learning looks like. What's some of your tips and your tricks for those of us who want to try and maintain a sense of balance? Like, I'm 25, 26 years into my education journey. I do have some pretty established principles that inform how I approach designing teaching and learning and curriculum design. But I do still try and check myself every now and again and saying, am I just, have I challenged my thinking recently? What would be some of your tips for people using research to keep their minds open to different ways of thinking?
Such a good question, and such an important thing to be doing. And it's something I like to try and do. So I read a pretty wide range of research. I read things produced by people with very different perspectives. And it's useful. It can be sometimes really hard and really confusing and quite confronting. But I think it's so important. And I think one of the things we can be doing, because you're right, we do naturally gravitate to pieces of research, to topics that align more or less with our core principles in relation to education. And that's only natural. And, I don't think that there's an issue with that. There is an issue when it prevents us from at least being open to thinking about other ideas, other perspectives. And so I think one way to do it can be to actually, there are growing numbers of people putting out blogs and articles, which are generally quite short, quick to read. Actually, every so often, reading something from someone that you would not normally engage with, and not automatically writing it off, but actually taking the time to stop and think, okay, is there anything I can take from this, can be really valuable. And if the answer is no, there's absolutely nothing I can take from this, I'd actually raise a few red flags about that, because generally with most arguments, there's some little thing you can glean that you think, oh, actually, that is useful to think about, or that is an interesting way of approaching it.
And I know, like, I've sort of always, I've sort of make throwaway comments about the NZ initiative, and like just a different representing a certain way of thinking. But I also do engage with their readings and their reports. And actually, Michael's report that he did around ILEs, and as someone who's a passionate proponent of innovative learning environments and the potential they have if you design learning that takes advantage of the physical spaces, I found that a hugely powerful piece of research. I thought it was really important. I didn't necessarily agree with all of the conclusions that were drawn and some of the ways that they were prevented, but there was a heck of a lot in their report where I sort of was nodding and agreeing and going, yes. And actually what this makes me realize is he's pointing out a need for further research to be done. He's, and for me, that became a real provocation for my dissertation that I did around community perception of ILEs and how people form their thinking around it. But it also made me realize that actually what he's pointing out is there's a lack of empirical research around the effectiveness of ILEs. I'm a school leader in the ILE space. What's my responsibility that I have to also be a producer of some of that research and that writing as well? So I think there's an important role to play for also being a consumer of research. What about teachers and leaders as producers of research? Because I think we've got a really important part to play. I feel like the heyday of blogging has passed a little bit, and we're not seeing so much deprivatization of practice that we once did. I think maybe it's fatigue, maybe it's busyness. I might be wrong. I might just be looking in the wrong places. But what's your thoughts about teachers as researchers and actually owning the space that they could claim in that area?
So I think it can be incredibly powerful. I think it's often not done particularly well. And that's not the fault of schools. It's not the fault of teachers, because I think what we're also seeing is that there are specialist skills that are involved with actually doing research. It's not a question of rocking up, asking a question and thinking about your practice and saying, okay, now I've done some research on it. So I think sometimes what gets presented as research by teachers probably doesn't actually meet formal definitions of research. Doesn't mean it's not valuable. But it does mean that it's easier for other people to shoot it down, to say, actually, that's not valid. That doesn't make a difference. So I think, first off, there's an interesting sort of distinction to play between teachers sharing aspects of their practice and the understandings of what worked well, what didn't work so well, what they're going to do next. And that's really valuable. I think there's so much more we could be doing around teachers as researchers, schools as sites of research, where we actually form proper partnerships between researchers and the schools. I think we often have academic researchers, often based in universities, saying, oh, we're forming a research practice partnership with a school. Is it actually a partnership? I would say often it's not, because there's a significant power imbalance going on. But I think if we could do that, wow, what an opportunity. And it's something I've thought quite a bit about, around how we can better engage with schools as sites of research, because the benefits are there for the schools to inform ongoing improvement in whatever aspect of their teaching and learning that they're wanting to focus on, but also, sharing that with the rest of the country as well.
And are there examples of that happening in other jurisdictions and countries?
There have been a few. So there have been a couple of quite successful long-running research practice partnerships in the US, where often they're actually a community effort. So it's between your sort of central organisation, and then a number of schools will be involved in it. And again, that's a really nice model, because then you've got schools not only learning about what they're doing and the impact that's having, but also building in that collaboration between schools, which we know doesn't always happen as naturally as it could.
Here's a really nuts and bolts question for you, Nina. So I'm a teacher. I want to do some research, and I want to do some research around learner agency, or some research around universal design for learning. Where do I start? Do I Google it? Do I go to, the Education Hub as my? I mean, what's your?
Well, I should always give a plug for the Education Hub.
If you really want to start on your engaging with research journey, where would you start?
So are you meaning teachers just as consumers of research, or teachers wanting to actually do a research project themselves?
I think consumers at this point.
So I think, on one level, you could go to somewhere like Google Scholar, which it has a bent towards, research studies. and do some keyword searches there about what's coming up. Often if you're engaging with a topic for the first time, there's something that's twigged your interest in it. So you probably have some sort of connection into it. So it might be, you've heard someone mention it. So following up with that person to say, hey, I'm really interested in learning more about learner agency. Where can I go for to read more, to find out more about it? Which is not a foolproof solution because it's actually really difficult.
And what's the trick of, and I know this is at the heart of what the Education Hub is all around, what's the trick between closing the gap between the consumption of research and translating it into practice in the classroom?
Yeah, something with
small question.
Yeah. No, but I mean, honestly, that's one of the big questions that we've been asking as an organisation for the last 7 years, right? Is that, we have done a reasonably good job of making reliable research information available to teachers. However, there's a big gap between engaging with reading something or watching a webinar and then actually being able to say, okay, what do I do in my practice to actually translate some of these ideas into there? And that's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing to do consistently as well. So you're absolutely right. It's a big gap. And we know that some teachers are better able to do that than others.
Yeah.
And often, you can try little bits and pieces, but you don't stick with it long enough, or you don't really think about how you need to shape it in your own context and sort of map that out as well. And I think probably one of the ways that can be really valuable, and one of the things that we've had quite a bit of feedback from people that have used our resources have said to us, is that where it becomes far more effective in that sort of translation process is when you're not doing it by yourself.
Yeah.
When you have someone else that you can talk to about it, you can share your ideas with, who, you can try something in your classroom and go and have a conversation with them about how it worked and where you're going to go next and so on. So you're not doing it alone. And I think, that isolation of teachers can be very real in our education system.
So I guess where we could be heading with this is talking maybe more about how schools and school communities can become environments that embrace research. What have you seen that's worked really well? I mean, obviously we've got our professional growth cycle. People have got these cycles of inquiry or teaching as inquiry, whatever the language and framework is that they use. What have you seen that's worked well for schools and that have created a community that really visibly prioritise engaging with research?
I think the first step is it's got to come from the top.
Mm-hmm.
That if you don't build that culture from your senior leadership team, it's very hard to get it infiltrating across all the teachers in a school. So, you absolutely have examples of individual teachers who get really excited about research and engage in that, but that doesn't build that culture that you're talking about. That actually has to come from the top, and the top talking about the value of research, actually engaging with research themselves.
Yeah.
And not just saying, okay, well, we're going to have a focus on engaging with research, hop to it, everyone, and do it. They actually have to be involved in that process as well. And creating opportunities and time for it as well. So not having it as always being, okay, well, in your own time, here's what you're going to do, but building it into the professional development that you're doing in school, supporting teachers to actually engage with that research, finding those opportunities for teachers to be discussing the research that they are engaging with.
Yeah, and then it's what as well do you think is the sweet spot in terms of I've been in schools that I feel like have done this really well, and I know it's something we endeavour to do, where we try and focus in and zero in on some priorities, because I think there's nothing worse than being like those Christmas tree schools where you're just picking up baubles and baubles and baubles and the latest thing that you heard at a conference. And, you need to distill down and say, actually, for a school, we're going to have 3 or 4 priorities, and we're going to stick to those 3 or 4 priorities for 2 to 4 years, and we're going to try and commit to not bringing on board further initiatives. What have you seen work and not work in that space in terms of prioritization? Because you don't want to be so narrow that you're missing opportunities for new learning, but at the same time, we're really aware of the cognitive bandwidth of our teachers and the actual time that they've got to engage with stuff meaningfully.
Yeah. Great question. So I think you're absolutely right that you've got to have priorities as a school. Where you've just got sort of free for all, or you're constantly going from one thing to the next, it's not going to work. And you're also right about, it's got to be more than just a year that you spend on this. Most, processes of changing something, trying something new takes more than a year to embed. And you need to go through iterative cycles of trying things, evaluating it, retrying things. So I think absolutely. Having those priorities is key, and having those priorities as the main focus for the majority of your professional development. That doesn't preclude if, a new topic comes up, or this.
Yeah, like suddenly AI feels like it's very important, and you can't ignore it.
It doesn't preclude you from doing something on it. It doesn't preclude teachers from reading further about it. And it doesn't stop you from being able to say, you might have a particular teacher that's struggling with something in particular, from giving them support in the area that they need support in. It's just the majority of the work that you're doing is focused on these priority areas.
Yeah. And so it's about realizing that time and cognitive bandwidth is a precious resource that we've got to make sure we use really carefully. Okay, just a couple of quick questions before we round up. You've been leading the Education Hub for 7 years now, Nina, and you're now stepping away from that role, which is both sad and exciting for you, because I know it's been an incredibly big journey and a big arc. What's been your thing that you're most proud of? What has been the real highlight for you in the last 7 years?
Great question.
I like how you say that to give yourself some time.
Yeah, it is.
Great question.
Totally is. You know me too well, Claire. Honestly, in some ways that we're still here.
Yeah.
And that people engage with us.
Yeah.
It never ceases to amaze me that people actually want to engage with the things that we do, the resources that we put out. That is incredible.
Yeah.
And awesome. And to know that over that time, year on year, we get more and more teachers engaging with us as well.
Yeah. And the flip side of it, what's been your biggest challenge or your biggest learning?
Oh, so many.
And we can come back to part 2.
But I think, on the topic of research, I think what I feel is that I know so much more now than I did 7 years ago, but I also know nothing.
Yeah.
And I think the more that I've engaged with research, I still believe in it, and I believe in what it can do. But boy, does it make me question everything else as well. And that, in education, nothing's certain.
No.
And there's never just one way of doing it. And, that can be really hard. Because, you want to have, if you just do this, then, everything's going to be great, and we're going to
But the idea that there's a silver bullet in education.
But there's really not.
Yeah.
And I firmly believe that. And I guess in some ways, I came into the organisation believing in the pluralism, that we need a pluralistic education system. And I leave absolutely believing that still.
So on that note, your best tip for helping educators navigate and avoid polarization, what is it?
You have to be open to listening to other
different
points of view.
Yeah.
You have to. And I don't mean that you have to agree with it all.
Yeah.
But if you're not even open to listening to it, if you write someone off just because of who they are and what you think you believe in, then we're sunk. Yeah. Because we can't even have a conversation then.
And that's really important, I think, in this period of time, in terms of when you're getting a new government in, and people have very raw, very real feelings about priorities and it not being the priorities that they believe we should have. I mean, at the end of the day, I always find myself reminding myself that, governments come and governments go, and we've got an incredible system where we actually have a whole lot of ownership of how we deliver curriculums in our school. And I know your report highlighted the fact that that presents some very real challenges, because it means there's not necessarily consistency of quality. But that does mean that regardless of that sort of national ministry priorities, whatever, we can still do what we believe is right by the young people that come into our school every single day. But with that comes a very real responsibility that whatever we design and whatever we do is informed by the very best attempts to be informed by research and informed by evidence from what's sitting in front of us. So I just I sort of feel like what you've just said is so important at the moment, that we don't become despondent because we think the priorities aren't what we think they should be, and that we lean into the fact that actually there's nothing stopping us getting on and doing the research and doing what we see is the right thing by our young people.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that flexibility that we have within the New Zealand education system can be an absolute gift.
Yeah.
I mean, what an opportunity to be able to utilize that to do what you think is going to be best. And I totally agree with you that comes with substantial responsibilities. And it is about making sure that you are making really informed decisions, that you're keeping up to date with the research on a range of different topics. And I think the other bit that I'd add is that you're also evaluating the impact that it's having.
Yeah.
And being open to making change if you need to. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you, Nina. And just in closing, what are some things? I'll put a link to your curriculum. I love that report that you put out around the curriculum design in New Zealand. What are some other ways in for if someone's going to go off from here and investigate the Education Hub? What's the best thing they can do? Where should they start? Sign up?
Well, absolutely. I mean, just explore.
Yeah.
We have so many resources on there. We've got, I think, across early childhood, primary and secondary school, we've got close to 800 different resources on there. Yeah. So there's a wealth of different information. So just have a bit of an explore, go through our topics, see what, resonates for you, what questions you might have, and then start reading something, start watching something.
And share. Awesome. Thank you, Nina. And thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Thank you as well for your 7 years of service in this space. I mean, I've been privileged enough to engage with you with different events and different initiatives that you've been working on. And I know that I come back time and time again to the Education Hub because it is a source of reliable, robust research papers and resources. So thank you for the work you've done, and all the best for whatever adventures in the pipeline. I won't get you to commit to anything here online because we all know that it's a bit of a mystery at this stage.
Indeed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And to everyone who is still with us here on DisruptEDTV, thank you for joining us today. And remember, as always, if there's a topic you'd like us to explore, if there's someone you'd like us to speak to, or in fact you would like it to be part of the conversation, please reach out here or over on the DisruptEd Facebook page. So thank you, Nina. Thank you to all of our listeners, and ka kite.